All right, hello, and welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel, and we try to shed light on great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, cosmologies, magnum opuses, tour de forces, earth-shattering discoveries that you probably haven't heard of before. And we are on our 8th day of going over the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception by B. Agent Ann Lee. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in Qumran, about 20 miles outside of Jerusalem, in the desert, at very, 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 very low altitude in 1947. And they were in a bunch of ceramic vases and in various stages of decomposition. And there were all kinds of different texts there, but they were kind of lumped into two different categories: the biblical material, which is mainly copies of Old Testament texts, in some cases almost exactly the same as the accepted versions of these Old Testament texts. Every single book, except for, I believe, Esther. And then there was this sectarian material, which was material that related directly to the life and times of the sect that created these documents and hid them in these caves in Qumran. And then the scrolls were juggled around for a while. People tried to figure out what to make of them. How old are they? What do they say? And eventually they were appointed to an international team of scholars who were tasked to, put out a series of books explaining what's in these things. And it seems pretty obvious that these people, these scholars, most of whom were actually not scholars, but were priests, Dominican priests especially, they found something in these documents that they did not want to talk about. And so they just started stalling and kicking the can down the road. And it got to be almost 40 years later, and we've still heard almost nothing from these people. This book was written in 1991, so that's 44 years after the scrolls were discovered. And I think the situation has gotten better since then, but I'm not exactly sure. I'm pretty sure I can find at least most of these Dead Sea Scrolls nowadays. But anyway, so we're talking about John Allegro. He's kind of the renegade of the international team. He's the guy on the international team that is like, let's get going. Let's publish this stuff. Let's get this stuff out there. And everybody else is like, chill out. We pretty much have a lifetime appointment to do this. Let's just let out the least important stuff every once in a while, and make sure we never let out some of this other stuff. Okay, so we'll take over right here. It is clear that in retrospect, Allegro never fully realized how sacrosanct the idea of Jesus's uniqueness was, and that as a result, he underestimated the lengths to which DeVoe, who's the leader of the international team, Dominican priest, and other members of the international team would go in order to distance themselves from his blunt approach. This was his only real mistake, so far that of expecting his colleagues to accept his assertions without letting their own religious allegiances influence their judgment. In his own view, he was addressing his material as a disinterested scholar and hoped they might eventually do likewise. His innocent jibe that by the time he'd finished, there'd be no church left for Struniel to join testifies to his conviction of how important and conclusive he felt his material to be, and to his excitement at the discovery. Now, Allegro, he became an agnostic at a certain point. I think even before he started studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. So he's kind of like the only person there that isn't really weighted by a pre-existing belief system. He's kind of could go one way or the other. On February 11th, DeVoe wrote back to Allegro, distinctly unamused. All the texts available to Allegro, DeVoe said, were also available to the other members of the team in Jerusalem. They had failed to find anything that supported Allegro's interpretation. In his reply on February 20th, Allegro attempted to stand his ground and at the same time repair the rift with his colleagues and diffuse the public controversy. Quote, "You will excuse me if I think that everyone in the world is going stark raving mad. I am enclosing my broadcast talks as you request, and if, after reading them, you are left wondering what all the fuss is about, you will be in precisely my position." Noting that Struniel and Malik were alleged to be preparing rebuttals of his statement, he commented, "I am not waging war against the church, and if I were, you may rest assured I would not let any loopholes in. I stand by everything I said in my 3 talks, but I am quite prepared to believe that there may be other interpretations of my readings." On March 4th, DeVoe replied, warning Allegro that a rebuttal was indeed being prepared. It would not be just from Struniel and Malik, however. Neither would it be confined to a scholarly journal. On the contrary, it would take the form of a letter to the Times in London and would be signed by all the members of the international team. Instead of being intimidated, Allegro was defiant. Not mincing words, he responded that a letter to the Times, quote, "should be most interesting to the London public who have never heard my broadcasts." Quote, "I have already pointed out to you that these broadcasts were made on the local northern station. You and your friends are now apparently going to draw the attention of the gutter press of this country to these passages, of which neither they nor the majority of their readers have heard, and start a witch hunt. I congratulate you. What will certainly happen is that the press, scenting trouble, will descend like hawks on me and want to know what it is all about. They will have added fuel in what appears on the face of it to be a controversy developing between the ecclesiastics of the scroll team and the one unattached member." He went on to invoke Edmund Wilson, indicating just how worried DeVoe's team should be by the suspicions Wilson had voiced. In effect, he was attempting to use Wilson as a deterrent. Having regard to what Wilson has already said about the unwillingness of the church to tackle these texts objectively, you can imagine what will be made out of this rumpus. This is still, another letter. So this is a quote. All this rumpus. Rumpus is not a word that I use that much. With all respect, I must point out to you that this nonsense of Wilson's has been taken seriously here. At every lecture on the scrolls I give, the same old question pops up. Is it true that the church is scared? And can we be sure that everything will be published? That may sound silly to you and me, but it is a serious doubt in the minds of ordinary folk. I need hardly add what effect the signatures of 3 Roman priests on the bottom of this proposed letter will have. It seems clear that by this time Allegro was becoming nervous. On March 6th, he wrote to another member of the international team, Frank Cross, who had just been offered an appointment at Harvard. Quote, I am awfully pleased about Harvard, not only because this Christianity business is played out, end quote. But in this same letter, he admitted that the barrage of criticism was wearing him down and that he was feeling both physically and mentally at the end of my tether. Certainly, he had no desire to see the publication of a letter which alienated him publicly from the other members of the team, and by so doing impugned his credibility. By now, of course, it was too late. On March 16, 1956, the letter duly appeared in the New York Times, or in the London Times, signed by Struniel as well as by Father DeVoe, Malik, Skihan, and Starkey, most of the team's big guns. There are no unpublished texts at the disposal of Mr. Allegro. This is a quote. There are no unpublished texts at the disposal of Mr. Allegro other than those of which the originals are at present in the Palestine Archaeological Museum, where we are working. Upon the appearance in the press of citations from Mr. Allegro's broadcasts, we were unable to see in the texts the findings of Mr. Allegro. We find no crucifixion of the teacher, no deposition from the cross, and no broken body of their master to be stood guard over until Judgment Day. Therefore, there is no well-defined Essenic pattern into which Jesus of Nazareth fits, as Mr. Allegro is alleged in one report to have said. It is our conviction that either he has misread the texts or he has built up a chain of conjectures which the materials do not support. To publish this sort of accusation, especially in a letter to the Times, is remarkable behavior. That was the end of the quote, sorry. Remarkable behavior. It patently reflects a conclave of academics ganging up on one of their own members, forced onto the defensive. Allegro replied with a letter to the Times of his own, which explained and justified his position. In the phraseology of the New Testament, in this connection we find many points of resemblance to Qumran literature, since the sect also were looking for the coming of a Davidic Messiah who would arise with the priest in the last days. It is in this sense that Jesus fits into a well-defined messianic, not Essenic, as I was wrongly quoted, pattern. There is nothing particularly new or striking in the idea. End quote. It is a reasonable enough statement, a legitimate correction of an important misquotation. It also indicates how eager Allegro's colleagues were to jump on him, to find an excuse for discrediting him. In any case, Allegro added, it is true that unpublished material in my care made me more willing to accept certain suggestions made previously by other scholars on what have appeared to be insufficient grounds. The bickering and ill feeling continued until finally on March 8th, 1957, Allegro wrote angrily to Struniel, you still do not seem to understand what you did in writing a letter to a newspaper in an attempt to smear the words of your own colleague. It was quite unheard of before, an unprecedented case of scholarly stabbing in the back, and Laddie Don't accuse me of dramatizing the business. I was here in England. Reuters, man, that morning on the phone to me was classic. But I thought you scholars stuck together. And when it was realized that, in fact, you were quoting things I never even said, the inference was plain. This letter was not in the interests of scholarly science at all, but to calm the fears of the Roman Catholics of America. And what it all boiled down to was that you guys did not agree with the interpretation I put on certain texts, where I have quite as much chance of being right as you. Rather than argue it out in the journals and scholarly works, you thought it easier to influence public opinion by a scurrilous letter to a newspaper. And you have the neck to call it scholarship. Dear boy, you are very young yet and have much to learn. I think Allegro is only like 34 years old at this point where he said that. I'm not sure how old the Struniel is. I guess he must have been younger. I know he was the protege of Malik, I think. As we have already noted, Allegro was the first of the international team to publish all the material entrusted to his charge. He remains the only one to have done so. John Struniel, on the other hand, in accordance with the go slow policy of the team, has published virtually nothing of the substantial materials at his disposal. The only major work to which he did address himself, entitled, quote, Notes in the Margin, comprises 113 pages of criticism of Allegro, which Eisenman labels a hatchet job. So this guy hasn't done a damn thing on his own scrolls, but he's managed to put out 113 pages of ripping on the one guy who did publish anything. In the meantime, the damage had been done. The letter to the Times, signed by DeVoe and 3 other ecclesiastics, effectively gave free rein to the Catholic propaganda machine. Opprobrium and vilification intensified in June 1956. For example, a Jesuit commentator published in the Irish Digest an article entitled, quote, The Truth About the Dead Sea Scrolls. He attacked Wilson, Dupont Sommer, and especially Allegro. He then went on to make the extraordinary statement that, quote, the scrolls add surprisingly little to our knowledge of the doctrines current among Jews from, say, 200 BC to the Christian era. He concluded in positively inflammatory fashion, quote, it was not from such a sect that Jesus learned how to be Messiah. Rather, it was from soil such as this that sprang the thorns which tried to choke the seed of the gospel. End quote. Allegro was now being portrayed not merely as an erring scholar, but as a veritable antichrist. While this controversy was still raging around him, Allegro was already becoming involved in another. The new bone of contention was to be the so-called Copper Scroll, found in Cave 3 at Qumran in 1952. As we have noted, the 2 fragments that made up the Copper Scroll remained unopened for 3.5 years. Speculation was rife about their contents. One researcher attempted to read the indentations showing through the copper and visible on the outside of the scroll. It seemed to say he suggested something about treasure. The suggestion elicited a salvo of derision from the international team. It proved, however, to be quite correct. In 1955, a year before his public dispute with his colleagues on the international team, Allegro had discussed the problem of the Copper Scroll with Professor H. Wright Baker of Manchester College of Technology. Wright Baker devised a machine that could slice the thin copper into strips, thus rendering the text legible. The first of the 2 fragments was accordingly sent to Manchester in Allegro's care in the summer of 1955. Wright Baker's machine performed his task, and Allegro quickly embarked on a translation of what had been revealed. The contents of the fragment proved so extraordinary that he kept them initially wholly to himself, not even indulging them or divulging them to Cross or Struniel, both of whom wrote to beg for details. His reticence cannot have improved his relations with them, but Allegro was in fact waiting for the second fragment of the scroll to arrive in Manchester. Any partial or premature disclosure, he felt, might jeopardize everything. For what the copper scroll contained was a list of secret sites where the treasure of the Temple of Jerusalem was alleged to have been buried. The second fragment was received in Manchester in January 1956. It was quickly sliced open and translated. Both fragments, along with accompanying translations, were then returned to Jerusalem. Only then did the real delays begin. DeVoe and the international team were worried about three things. Their first concern was valid enough. If the contents of the scroll were made public and stories of buried treasure began to circulate, the Bedouin would be digging up the entire Judean desert, and much of what they found might disappear forever or elude scholarly hands and slip into the black market. Something of this sort was in fact already occurring. On discovering or learning of a potentially productive site, the Bedouin would set up a large black tent over it, loot it, pick it clean, and sell their plunder privately to antique dealers. DeVoe and the international team were also worried that the treasure inventoried in the copper scroll might actually exist, might be a real treasure rather than an imaginary one. If it were indeed real, it would inevitably attract the attention of the Israeli government, who would almost certainly lay claim to it. Not only might this remove it from the authority of the international team, it might also trigger a major political crisis. For while Israel's claim might be legitimate enough, much of the treasure and the scroll specifying its location would have been found in Jordanian territory. If the treasure were real, moreover, there were theological grounds for concern. DeVoe and the international team had been intent on depicting the Qumran community as an isolated enclave, having no connection with public events, political developments, or the mainstream of first century history. If the copper scroll did indeed indicate where the actual contents of the temple lay hidden, Qumran could no longer be so depicted. On the contrary, connections would become apparent between Qumran and the temple, the center and focus of all Judaic affairs. Qumran would no longer be a self-contained and insulated phenomenon, but an adjunct of something much broader, something that might encroach dangerously on the origins of Christianity. More disturbing still, if the copper scroll referred to a real treasure, it could only be a treasure removed from the temple in the wake of the AD 66 revolt. This would upset the safe dating and chronology which the international team had established for the entire corpus of scrolls. The combination of these factors dictated a cover-up. Allegro at first colluded in it, assuming that delays in releasing the information about the copper scroll would only be temporary. In consequence, he agreed not to mention anything of the scroll in the book he was preparing, his general introduction to the Qumran material, scheduled to be published by Penguin Books later in 1956. In the meantime, it was arranged Father Malik would prepare a definitive translation of the copper scroll, which Allegro would follow with another popular book pitched to the general public. Allegro had consented to a temporary delay in releasing information about the copper scroll. He certainly didn't expect the delay to prolong itself indefinitely. Still less did he expect the international team to diffuse the scroll's significance by dismissing the treasure it inventoried as purely fictitious. When Malik proceeded to do so, Allegro did not at first suspect any sort of conspiracy. In a letter to another of his colleagues, dated April 23, 1956, he gave vent to his impatience, but remained excited and optimistic, and referred to Malik with cavalier disdain. Quote, "Heaven only knows when, if ever, our friends in Jerusalem are going to release the news of the Copper Scroll. It's quite fabulous. Just imagine the agony of having to let my book go to the press without being able to breathe a word of it." Just pointing out, I mean, this is, I kind of find it a little bit hard to believe that they're trying to call it fictitious or trying to suppress it. I would think that they would be at least going to the site and seeing if they could find the treasure, seeing as how it's like 25 tons of gold or 26 tons of gold and 65 tons of silver. You would think that they would at least take the chance of like, okay, maybe this is right. Let's at least, get somebody out there to dig a little bit, But instead, apparently, they're trying to just dismiss it. Maybe they are doing it in the background. A month later, Allegro wrote to Gerald Lancaster Harding, in charge of the Jordanian Department of Antiquities and DeVoe's colleague. Perhaps he already sensed something was in the wind and was trying to circumvent DeVoe personally to appeal to an alternative and non-Catholic authority. In any case, he pointed out that as soon as the press release pertaining to the Copper Scroll was issued, reporters would descend en masse. To deal with this contingency, he suggested that Harding, the international team, and everyone else involved close ranks and adopt a party line toward the media. On May 28th, Harding, who had been warned and briefed by DeVoe, wrote back, "The treasure listed in the Copper Scroll," he said, "didn't appear to be connected with the Qumran community at all. Nor could it possibly be a real cache. The value of the items cited was too great. The Copper Scroll was merely a collation of buried treasure legends." 4 days later, on June 1st, the official press release pertaining to the Copper Scroll was issued. It echoed Harding's assertions. The scroll was said to contain a collection of traditions about buried treasure. Allegro appears to have been stunned by this duplicity. On June 5th, he wrote to Harding, "I don't quite follow whether this incredible traditions gag you and your chums are putting out is for newspaper, government, Bedouin, or my consumption. Or you may even believe it, bless you." At the same time, however, he was still that's ended quote. At the same time, however, he was still appealing to Harding as a possible ally against the phalanx of Catholic interests. Did not Harding think, he asked, that a bit more ready information on these scroll matters might not be a good idea? It's well known now that the Copper Scroll was completely open in January, and despite your attempts to squash it, it is also known that my translation went to you immediately. A little general information saves a good deal of rumor-mongering, which has now taken on a somewhat sinister note. He added that the feeling would get around that the Roman Catholic brethren of the team, by far in the majority, were trying to hide things. The same point is stressed in a letter to Frank Cross in August. Quote, "In lay quarters, it is firmly believed that the Roman Church in DeVoe and Company are intent on suppressing this material." To DeVoe, personally, he observed dryly, quote, "I notice that you have been careful to keep it dark, that the treasure is temple possessions." Okay, I think we're going to stop right there. The next paragraph. We can try to do one more paragraph. Allegro had originally believed a full translation of the text of the Copper Scroll would be released fairly promptly. It must now have been clear to him that this wasn't going to occur. In fact, 4 years were to pass before a translation of the text appeared, and then it was published by Allegro himself, who by that time had lost all patience with the international team. He still would have preferred to publish his book after the official translation, scheduled to be done by Father Malik, and was led to believe this would be possible. Malik's translation, however, was suddenly and unexpectedly subject to further delays, which may have well been deliberate. Allegro was asked to postpone his own publication accordingly. At one point, indeed, this request, transmitted through an intermediary, appears to have been attended by threats from a member of the team whose name cannot be divulged for legal reasons. Allegro replied that, quote, "As conveyed to me, the request was accompanied by the expression of some rather strange sentiments originating, it was said, from yourself and those for whom you were acting. There appeared even to be some forecast of consequences were I not to accede to this request." The recipient of this letter wrote back sweetly that Allegro must not imagine himself the victim of persecution. Thus, when Allegro went ahead with his own publication, he found himself in the embarrassing position of seeming to have preempted the work of a colleague. In effect, he had been maneuvered into providing the international team with further ammunition to use against him, and, of course, to alienate him further from them. Malik's translation, in fact, did not appear until 1962, 2 years after Allegro's, 6 years after the Copper Scroll had been sliced open in Manchester, and 10 years after it had been discovered. Okay, we're going to stop right there, and I will take over tomorrow at this spot right here. So thanks for tuning in today, and have a great